So let's get into a little bit on the Bitcoin side of things. And I think this next question kind of goes to how the mindset of investors or even just anyone can kind of rotate over time. So in 2013, you tweeted, Bitcoin's names are numbered. It seems like just a matter of time before it suffers the same fate as online gambling. And I'd love to know your mindset of like, when did it change? Was it when you started looking into it more, when it became adopted more? What was your thought process there?
Well, when it got 100 times bigger, that helped. You know, Bitcoin is $1 billion, or $2 billion thing. Looks like it could be displaced, but Bitcoin became a $200 billion network by the beginning and middle of 2020. So I think that I was persuaded by the fact that it had been, it stood the test of time. It was 10 years old. It was a multi-$100 billion network. And at that point, I understood why you needed it. I didn't need it. I don't think the world needed it as much. The monetary inflation rate from 2010 to 2020 was 7% in the Western world. If you were in Argentina or Venezuela, it was much higher. So if you lived in a developing country where your currency collapsed, then you know why you needed it. So early adopters of Bitcoin, a lot of times there were people from South America, Argentina. They were very sensitive to the plights in Africa and Asia. Or they were, you know, libertarians or very sensitive cyberpunks, et cetera. So that was one group. I think in 2020, the problem came to the United States and Europe because now you had 20% monetary inflation. You have a collapse of the currency, a devaluation of the currency. The best indicator of the currency strength is the rate of appreciation of the S&P 500. So the S&P appreciated on average 10% a year for 100 years and appreciated 40% in the past 12 months. So if it used to be going up 10% a year and then went up 40%, then you can presume that the currency was 30% weaker than it had been weakening. So I think that was the tipping point. It was the massive money printing that brought monetary inflation to the forefront of the mainstream investor. And I don't even know if I say mainstream investor. Let's just say 1% of the world cared about it in the Western world before, and then all of a sudden 10%, 20% started really focusing upon it in 2020, and I was one of that 10 to 20%.
Do you think that it's a good way? Like, I've always viewed Bitcoin and my holdings in Bitcoin as being, you know, my concern with what the Federal Reserve is doing with printing money. The debt in the US is rising. You know, all the central banks in the world are printing money. And it's always been kind of my thought process as a digital gold for me to kind of store and keep my value as the dollar gets diluted. Are you along those lines, or you're more like a currency, like people should be going into Starbucks and buying things with Bitcoin?
I don't really think it's a currency. I think it's a property, or it's an asset. Digital gold is a good metaphor. You have $1 million, you want to hold it for 100 years. Your choice is buy $1 million worth of gold, $1 million worth of land, $1 million worth of art, $1 million worth of stock, $1 million worth of bonds, or $1 million worth of dollars. And if you just check through those, or $1 million worth of baseball cards or collectibles, if you check through all of those things, you know, the conclusion is what you'd like to have is something as good as gold without the defects of gold, but as good as FANG stocks, but without the fragility of FANG stocks. So how do I fix gold? I fix gold by making it impossible to mine any more gold and making it instant and free to audit the gold, and then make it instant and free to move the gold from this side of the earth to that side of the earth and make it programmable. So that makes it better gold. And how do I fix a FANG stock? You could buy a portfolio of Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google. I mean, that's what I held a bunch of that for a decade. Pretty good trade, went up by a factor of 10 to 20. Yeah. What's the problem? They might get unionized at Amazon. There might be an antitrust, movement against Google or against Facebook or against Apple. There might be an employment tax, there might be an income tax, there might be a tariff trade rule. They might ship the wrong iPhone. Maybe the Google Android phone beats the iPhone. Maybe the CEO goes bonkers. Maybe something else happens. The bottom line is the product, the board, the CEO, the company, the nexus, the office, the employees, and the earnings are all risks of a company, even a monopoly. If it's a monopoly, that's the risk, right? I mean, a politician might decide to tax or regulate a monopoly. If it's not a monopoly, then your competitor is the risk. So what if I could just keep the power of big tech, but get rid of the CEO, the product, the company, and the quarterly releases? And if you could do that, you would have Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is like digital gold without the defects and the material problem of gold. And it's also big tech without the risk of big tech. And so think of it as big tech gold. It's property that has the least likelihood of being impaired. If you're an information theorist, or if you're an engineer, the first thing they teach you is the more moving parts, the more parts to break. That's Murphy's Law. So what if I just wanted to create a machine that had the least number of moving parts? Okay, I fire the CEO, I fire the board. There are no quarterly releases. There are no products. There are no services. There are no employees. There's no offices. There is no country. It's just software running on 10,000 nodes scattered to the four winds. And what does it do? It just is. It doesn't do anything. On one hand, it's the simplest possible product. I just keep track of the ownership of 21 million virtual things. Simplest thing imaginable, a million times simpler than Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon. On the other hand, it is like plankton. You are a beautiful peacock, or you are an eagle if you're a company and you can fly, or you are a whale or a dolphin and you can do flips. Not Bitcoin. Bitcoin is plankton. But my money's on the plankton, right? After the nuclear apocalypse, the plankton will probably still be here because it's so simple. What is there to break? Right? That's the idea of Bitcoin. I'm investing money in the simplest, most robust, most anti-fragile, durable thing I can think of, with the idea that there aren't moving parts to break and there's no person to screw it up.
Do you worry at all? I mean, in terms of not being a company, Bitcoin doesn't have those risks. But then, you have China making what you called a terrible mistake, in a $1 trillion mistake, in terms of, outlawing or banning Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. I think for me, I've always looked at it as like they want their digital yuan to be the future reserve currency of the world. So they're trying to get rid of the competition, essentially. But then, you look at the risk for Bitcoin. Do you ever see the United States government, not necessarily banning it, but trying to clamp down and as a risk factor? Or do you think it's getting too big where, I mean, once you have MicroStrategy's investing and Tesla investing, they can't really clamp down on it at that point?
I think the thing to keep in mind about the crypto ecosystem is there are digital properties, there is digital currency, and there are digital applications. Digital property is, I just own one block in cyber Manhattan called a Bitcoin, and there are 21 million other. I just own one. What do? I just own it. What does it do? It just sits there. It's property. That's taxed as property by the IRS. That is property rights. Any country that gives you property rights will let you own it. As far as I can tell, China hasn't banned the ownership of Bitcoin yet. You can still own it. So as property, there isn't that much regulatory risk, certainly not in the Western world. I think in Western Europe, the United States, if you can own $1 million of gold, and if you can own $1 million of a spider, and if you can own $1 million of land, you can own $1 million of Bitcoin. You should start worrying when we flip to a communist regime or a socialist regime, when they steal your building and they take your art and they take your house and they take your stocks and they take your cash and they take your gold. Yeah, they're probably going to try to take your Bitcoin too. But of all those things, Bitcoin will be the hardest thing for them to take. They will take all the other stuff first. Everything else you own in this world, will be taken from you before they take your Bitcoin. Now, the other aspect, digital currency, yeah, nobody wants you to threaten their currency. So, you're not going to be able to transfer $1 million of Bitcoin tax-free in private.